This story is titled, My Golden Brother Abused Me. My whole childhood and my parents sided with him. Now they are begging me for help. Hey everyone. The channel's been slowing down a bit, and I spend so much time finding these stories for you. If you enjoy the content, please hit that subscribe button. It means the world and helps keep this journey going strong. Let's grow together. Now let's start the video. OP starts by saying, Christmas 2015 was a disaster waiting to happen, but I didn't know that at the time. I was 15, the overlooked middle child in a family of 3 siblings. My older brother Dan, the golden child, was 19, and my younger sister was too little to get involved in much of anything. All eyes were on Dan. Always Dan. The kid could do no wrong in my parents' eyes. He was the charming athlete, the one with the loud laugh and easy confidence. I used to look up to him when we were kids, but somewhere along the line, that admiration twisted into resentment. Dan had a temper, a nasty one. And when he drank, which he'd been doing since he was barely old enough to drive, that temper became a weapon. The Christmas dinner table looked as picture-perfect as ever. Mom had outdone herself with the decorations, setting out polished silverware and candles that smelled like pine and cinnamon. Dad hovered near the TV, pretending to care about football, while really sneaking sips of whiskey from his mug. Dan, meanwhile, was already on his 3rd beer before we even sat down. Nice apron, Dan said, smirking at me as I carried a tray of roasted vegetables to the table. Did Mom put you in charge of the kitchen again? What are you, her little sous chef? I ignored him, but my cheeks burned. I liked helping Mom cook, but Dan never missed an opportunity to turn something I enjoyed into a jab. By the time dinner started, Dan was buzzing with alcohol and bad energy. He made snide comments about everything. The food, Dad's non-existent cooking skills, even Mom's centerpiece arrangement. But his favorite target, as always, was me. You still getting C's in math, loser? He said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Don't worry, not everyone's cut out for college. Maybe you can be a chef or something. You're good at carrying trays. I clenched my fists under the table, my appetite disappearing. Mom tried to laugh it off, saying, Oh, Dan, stop teasing. But she never really stopped him. She didn't dare. No one did. But this year, Dan wasn't satisfied with just words. After a few more beers, his mood turned dark. He started grilling me about why I wasn't helping out more around the house, or pulling my weight. The irony was rich, considering Dan never lifted a finger unless it was to open another bottle. You're such a lazy little prick, he snapped, leaning across the table. His voice was slurred, but his words cut deep. Mom and Dad do everything for you. You think life's just gonna hand you a free ride? I couldn't take it anymore. At least I'm not a drunk, I shot back, my voice shaking with anger. The table fell silent. For a second, I thought maybe I'd finally gotten through to him. But then Dan's face twisted into something I barely recognized. He stood up so fast his chair toppled over, his fists clenched like he was ready to fight. You little shit, he spat. Say that again. Before I could even think about backing down, he lunged. His fist connected with my face and the world spun. I hit the floor hard, tasting blood and feeling the hot sting of tears. Dan, stop it! Mom screamed, rushing to pull him back. Dad grabbed Dan by the shoulders, dragging him into the living room while he cursed and yelled about how I deserved it. I sat there on the floor, stunned. My nose was bleeding, my cheekbone throbbed, and my mom, she didn't even look at me. She was too busy trying to calm Dan down, stroking his arm and whispering, It's okay, sweetie. Just breathe. When the chaos settled, Mom pulled me aside. You shouldn't have said that to him, she said, her voice sharp. You know how Dan gets. You provoked him. Provoked him? I repeated, incredulous. He punched me in the face. You're fine, she said dismissively. Family sticks together no matter what. You need to apologize to Dan. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Apologize? For what? For standing up to him? For bleeding all over her precious tablecloth? I wanted to scream, but instead, I just nodded numbly and went to my room, slamming the door behind me. That night, as I lay in bed with an ice pack pressed to my swollen cheek, I realized something. Dan wasn't the problem. Not really. The real problem was my parents. How they coddled him, excused him, enabled him. They'd rather protect their golden boy than admit he was anything less than perfect. And if that meant throwing me under the bus, so be it. The cracks in our family had been there for years, but now they were splitting wide open. And deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. After Christmas 2015, things didn't just go back to normal. If anything, they got worse. Dan's punch to my face wasn't just a one-time outburst, it was a turning point. From then on, It felt like he had complete license to treat me however he wanted. And my parents? They didn't just let it happen. They enabled it. Dan didn't apologize, of course. Instead, he acted like I was the one who'd wronged him. He walked around the house with this smug confidence, like he'd proven something. I couldn't figure out what was worse, his arrogance or my parents' silence. Mom kept saying things like, "Dan's just under a lot of stress," and Dad would mutter, "Boys will be boys," whenever I tried to bring it up. But I wasn't just going to let it slide. Not this time. Something inside me had snapped that night, and I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. I started avoiding Dan altogether, locking myself in my room when he was home, eating dinner quickly so I wouldn't have to sit through his taunts. But it didn't take long for him to notice. "What's the matter, little bro? You scared of me now?" he'd say, blocking my path in the hallway. He'd lean in close, grinning like it was all some big joke. "Don't worry, I won't hit you again. Unless you give me a reason." It was infuriating. I wanted to fight back, to wipe that smug look off his face, but I knew better. Dan was bigger, stronger, and way more reckless than me. Any physical confrontation would end badly. So I did the only thing I could. I started planning my escape. I threw myself into school. I wasn't a great student by any means, but I knew that getting good grades was my ticket out of this house. I started staying late at the library, telling my parents I had group projects, when really I just wanted to be anywhere but home. It worked, for a while. But Dan wasn't content to let me have my peace. He started escalating his behavior, finding new ways to get under my skin. If I left my textbooks out, he'd scribble over my notes with crude drawings. If I tried to watch TV, he'd change the channel and tell me to go do something useful. And whenever I confronted him, he'd laugh and say, "Relax, it's just a joke." One night, he took it too far. It was a Friday, and I'd just gotten home from school. I'd been working on an essay that was worth 30% of my final grade, and I'd left my laptop charging on the dining table. When I walked into the house, I found Dan sitting there, flipping through my essay like it was a comic book. "What you working on, nerd?" he said, grinning as he scrolled through the pages. "Give it back," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Chill out. I'm just looking," he said, but there was a glint in his eye that made my stomach drop. Before I could stop him, he deleted the file. Just like that. 3 weeks of work. Gone in an instant. He laughed as I lunged for the laptop, holding it out of my reach like we were kids playing keep away. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I yelled, my voice cracking. "Relax," he said, tossing the laptop onto the table. "You've got time to rewrite it. Besides, maybe it'll actually be good this time." I wanted to scream, to hit him, to do anything that would wipe that smug look off his face. But I knew it wouldn't matter. Dan always got away with everything, and this time would be no different. I stormed upstairs and slammed the door to my room, shaking with rage. I could hear my parents downstairs asking Dan what had happened. His response? "Oh, he's just being dramatic." And they believed him. Of course they did. When I tried to tell them what he'd done, my mom sighed and said, "You need to stop letting him get to you. He's your brother. You should be able to handle a little teasing." Teasing! That's what she called it. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait until college to get out of this house. I needed to leave, and I needed to do it soon. I started looking for part-time jobs, saving every penny I could. I didn't care where I went. I just needed to get as far away from Dan as possible. But leaving wasn't going to be enough. I wanted revenge. Not the petty, impulsive kind, but something that would actually hurt him. Something that would make him feel the way he'd made me feel all these years. Powerless, humiliated, and completely alone. I didn't have a plan yet, but I knew one thing for sure. Dan's reign of terror wasn't going to last forever. And when it all came crashing down, I was going to make damn sure I wasn't there to pick up the pieces. By the spring of 2016, the tension in the house was unbearable. Dan had crossed every line imaginable, and I was done playing the peacekeeper. I couldn't fight him physically. I'd lose every time, but I could start chipping away at the pedestal my parents had put him on. It was time to make him pay. Dan had no idea how much trouble he was in. He was too busy coasting through life on his charm and my parents' unwavering support. But there were cracks in his golden boy image, and I planned to exploit every single one of them. Dan had always been reckless, but lately it was like he was daring the universe to catch up with him. He'd drop out of community college after one semester, claiming it was boring, and spent most of his days drinking, playing video games, and mooching off my parents. They'd complain about his lack of direction, but the second he flashed that winning smile, they'd let it go. Meanwhile, I was putting in the work. I'd landed a part-time job at a local coffee shop, saving up every penny I could for my eventual escape. I started studying harder, not just to keep my grades up, but to prove, to myself more than anyone else, that I was better than this mess of a household. But Dan couldn't leave well enough alone. He saw me working hard and hated it. I think it reminded him of what he wasn't doing. So, he doubled down on being the world's biggest jerk. He started borrowing my money, rifling through my room when I wasn't home and taking whatever cash I'd stashed away. When I confronted him, he'd shrug and say, "I'll pay you back." But he never did. One day, I came home to find my favorite jacket missing, the one my grandma had given me before she passed away. When I asked Dan about it, he smirked and said, "Oh, that old thing. Sold it. Needed beer money." That was it. The final straw. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was furious. And I knew exactly how to hit him where it hurt. Dan had a secret. For all his charm and swagger, he wasn't as bulletproof as he liked to pretend. He'd been stealing from my parents for months, using Dad's credit card to buy booze and video games. I'd stumbled across the evidence by accident. A bank statement left on the kitchen counter, with charges my parents couldn't explain. I didn't say anything at first. I wanted to be smart about it, to make sure there was no way he could talk his way out of this one. So, I started gathering proof. I'd take pictures of receipts, screenshots of his online orders, and even recorded him bragging to his friends about how he was living rent-free and using the old man's money. Then, one night, I struck. It was late and everyone else was asleep. I slipped into my parents' room and left a neatly organized folder on their nightstand. Inside were all the receipts, screenshots, and recordings I'd collected over the past few weeks. I didn't leave a note. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. The next morning, I woke up to chaos. "What the hell is this?" Dad's voice boomed through the house. I peeked out of my room to see him holding the folder, his face red with rage. Mom was sitting on the couch crying, while Dan stood there, looking like a deer caught in headlights. "I can explain," Dan started, but Dad cut him off. "Explain? You've been stealing from us, Dan. Thousands of dollars. And you thought we wouldn't notice?" "I was going to pay it back!" Dan shouted, his voice cracking. I needed it, okay? I'm under a lot of pressure." "Pressure?" Mom said, her voice trembling. "You don't have a job, Dan. You dropped out of school. What pressure?" Dan's excuses fell apart under their scrutiny. For the first time, my parents weren't buying his crap. I stayed in my room, listening to the shouting match unfold, a small smile creeping across my face. Dan's punishment wasn't as severe as I'd hoped. My parents couldn't bring themselves to kick him out. But they did cut him off financially. No more free rides, no more credit card handouts. He was furious, of course, but there was nothing he could do about it. He'd finally been exposed for the fraud he was. But Dan wasn't just mad at my parents. He was livid with me. He knew somehow that I'd been the one to rat him out. He didn't have proof, but he didn't need it. From that day on, he made it his mission to make my life hell. He'd blast music late at night when I was trying to study. He'd accidentally break my stuff. My headphones, my phone charger, even my alarm clock. He'd spread rumors about me at school, calling me a snitch and a mommy's boy. It hurt, sure, but it didn't matter. I'd already won. Because while Dan was spiraling, I was getting ready to leave. By the end of the school year, I had enough money saved up to move out. I found a small apartment with a couple of roommates, close enough to school, but far enough away from Dan and my parents. When I told them I was leaving, Mom cried, saying, "You don't have to go, we can work this out." But I'd made up my mind. "I need space," I told her. "This isn't healthy, for any of us." Dan didn't say a word when I left. He just glared at me from the corner of the room. His jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. I could see the hatred in his eyes, but I didn't care. Let him hate me. I was free. I'd been out of the house for nearly a year when Dan's life began to unravel. At first, I only heard bits and pieces through mutual acquaintances, or the occasional message from my mom. But the more I learned, the more it became clear. Dan's golden boy charm was wearing thin, and reality was finally catching up with him. When I moved out, I thought I'd feel relief immediately, like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. And in some ways, I did. No more taunts, no more stolen money, no more feeling like I was invisible in my own home. But there was still a part of me that was waiting to see if Dan would finally face the consequences of his actions. At first, it didn't seem like much had changed. Dan still lived at home, freeloading off my parents, and barely holding down a part-time job at a local hardware store. Mom would text me now and then, telling me how hard Dan was trying and how he was just figuring things out. I ignored her. I wasn't interested in her excuses anymore. Then, one day, I got a call from my dad. "He got fired," Dad said, his voice heavy. Apparently, he showed up late one too many times and they had enough. I didn't say much. Just a polite, "Oh, that's too bad." But inside, I was grinning. Dan losing his job felt like poetic justice. Just one more crack in his carefully curated facade. But it didn't stop there. Over the next few months, things went from bad to worse. Dan started drinking even more, blowing what little money he had on booze and nights out with his equally useless friends. He'd come home late, stumbling through the door and waking up the whole house. Mom and Dad were at their wits' end, but they still couldn't bring themselves to kick him out. "He just needs some support," Mom said during one of her calls. "He's going through a rough patch." "Sounds like a self-inflicted rough patch," I replied, not bothering to hide my disdain. The real turning point came when Dan got into legal trouble. He and a couple of his friends had been out drinking when they decided it'd be a good idea to drive to another bar. One thing led to another, and they ended up in a minor car accident. No one was seriously hurt, but Dan was arrested for driving under the influence. When I heard the news, I wasn't surprised. If anything, I was surprised it hadn't happened sooner. What did surprise me was the phone call I got from my mom later that night. "We need your help," she said, her voice shaky. "Dan's in jail, and we can't afford to bail him out." I almost laughed out loud. "You're asking me to help Dan? Seriously? He's your brother," she said, the guilt thick in her tone. "Family sticks together." That phrase, "family sticks together," made my blood boil. How many times had she said that to me, only to turn around and defend Dan's behavior? How many times had I been told to suck it up, to apologize, to keep the peace, while Dan got away with everything? "Sorry, Mom," I said, my voice icy, "but I'm not interested in sticking together anymore." She tried to argue, but I hung up before she could finish. I wasn't going to let her guilt trip me into cleaning up Dan's mess. Not this time. A few days later, I got an unexpected visitor. I was sitting in my apartment, enjoying a rare day off, when there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, there he was. Dan, looking more disheveled than I'd ever seen him. His hair was a mess, his clothes were wrinkled, and there was a desperation in his eyes that almost made me feel sorry for him. Almost. "Hey," he said, shifting uncomfortably. "Can I come in?" I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "What do you want?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I screwed up, okay? I need help." Hearing him admit he'd screwed up was almost satisfying. Almost. But it wasn't enough to erase years of torment. "You're going to have to be more specific," I said, keeping my tone cold. "What kind of help are you looking for?" He hesitated, glancing down at the floor. "I need money. Just enough to get back on my feet. I swear I'll pay you back." I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that made him flinch. "You want my help? After everything you've done to me?" "That was a long time ago," he said quickly. "I was a dumb kid. I didn't know any better." "Bullshit," I snapped. "You knew exactly what you were doing. And now you want me to bail you out? Not a chance." Dan's face twisted in frustration. "Come on, man. I'm your brother. Were you thinking about that when you stole my money? Or when you deleted my essay? When you punched me in the face?" I stepped closer, my voice rising. "You don't get to play the family card now, Dan. You burned that bridge a long time ago." He opened his mouth to argue, but I slammed the door in his face before he could get a word out. That was the last time I saw Dan in person. Mom called me a few days later, begging me to reconsider, but I stood my ground. "If you want to keep enabling him, that's your choice," I said, "but don't expect me to clean up his mess." From what I heard, Dan eventually got bailed out, probably by my parents, who drained their savings to cover his legal fees. But the fallout from his arrest was severe. His reputation was ruined, his friends abandoned him, and he couldn't hold down a job to save his life. Meanwhile, I was thriving. I'd landed a promotion at work, started dating someone amazing, and finally felt like I was in control of my life. Dan's misery didn't consume me the way it once might have, but there was a certain satisfaction in knowing that he was finally facing the consequences of his actions. The moment I closed the door in Dan's face, I felt an overwhelming sense of liberation. It wasn't just about denying him the help he so desperately needed, it was about reclaiming my power. For years, I'd been the target of his cruelty, the scapegoat in my family's twisted dynamics. But now, the tables had turned, and it was my turn to watch him flounder. Life after cutting Dan out was better than I could have ever imagined. For the first time, I didn't feel the weight of my family's dysfunction hanging over me. I threw myself into work, where my dedication started paying off in ways I hadn't anticipated. My manager noticed my efforts and offered me a promotion, complete with a pay bump and more responsibilities. I didn't just take the job, I excelled at it. Outside of work, my personal life was thriving too. I'd started dating someone incredible, someone who didn't just tolerate my past, but encouraged me to grow beyond it. We moved in together after a few months, transforming my modest apartment into a home filled with warmth and laughter. Something I'd never had growing up. Dan's name rarely came up in conversation, but every so often, I'd get updates from mutual acquaintances or occasionally my mom. She'd call to tell me about how hard things were for Dan, hoping, I'm sure, to guilt me into helping him. "He's your brother," she'd say, her voice full of that familiar mixture of pleading and disappointment. "And?" I'd reply coldly, "He made his bed. Let him lie in it." I wasn't about to let her drag me back into their chaos. I'd worked too hard to escape it, and I wasn't going to throw it all away for someone who had never once shown me an ounce of kindness. While my life was on the upswing, Dan's was heading in the opposite direction. Losing his job had been just the beginning. After his DUI, he'd become a pariah, even among his so-called friends. His drinking got worse, and without a steady income, he started borrowing, or rather, demanding money from my parents. At first, they gave in. Mom couldn't bear to see her golden boy struggle, and Dad, as always, went along with whatever she wanted. But their patience wore thin when they realized Dan had no intention of changing. He wasn't looking for help. He was looking for a crutch. When I heard about how he'd tried to sell my parents' belongings to fund his drinking, I wasn't surprised. Dan had always been good at taking without giving anything in return. The only difference now was that he didn't have me to blame for his problems. The ultimate act of karma came a few years later. By this point, I was well established in my career, earning enough to afford a comfortable lifestyle. My partner and I were even talking about buying a house. Life was good, stable, happy, and completely free of my family's toxicity. Then, one day, I got a call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Hey," a voice croaked on the other end. It took me a second to recognize it, but when I did, my stomach turned. "Dan?" I said, my tone flat. "Yeah," he muttered. I need your help." I almost hung up right then and there, but curiosity got the better of me. "What kind of help?" There was a long pause. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with desperation. "I'm screwed, man. I lost my place, and Mom and Dad won't let me stay with them anymore. I just need a place to crash for a bit. Maybe some money to get back on my feet." I couldn't help but laugh, a cold, bitter sound that cut through the silence. "You think I'm going to help you? After everything you've done?" "I know I messed up," he said quickly. "But we're brothers. You can't just leave me out here." "Watch me," I replied, the satisfaction in my voice impossible to hide. "You spent years tearing me down, Dan. Years. And now you want me to save you? Not a chance." "Come on, man," he begged. "I'm not asking for much. You're not asking for anything. Because the answer is no," I snapped. "You don't get to treat me like garbage and then come crawling back when your life falls apart. You're on your own." Before he could say another word, I hung up and blocked the number. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. That call was the last I ever heard from Dan. From what I've pieced together, he's still struggling, couch surfing, bouncing between odd jobs, and burning every bridge he comes across. My parents have finally stopped enabling him, though not out of principle. They simply don't have anything left to give. As for me, I've built a life I'm proud of. A life full of love, respect, and success. All the things Dan tried to take from me. And the best part? He has to watch from the sidelines, knowing he'll never be a part of it. Revenge isn't always about grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it's as simple as thriving in spite of everything. By choosing happiness, I took back the power Dan and my family had over me. And that, more than anything, is the sweetest revenge of all. It's been years since I cut ties with Dan and my parents, and I haven't looked back. I don't regret my decision. It was the only way to save myself. But I've also learned that moving on doesn't mean forgetting. The scars they left are still there, but they're a part of who I am now. A reminder of what I've overcome. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by love, respect, and mutual support. And I've found that, not in the family I was born into, but in the one I've chosen for myself. Here's to living well, loving fully, and never letting the past define you. The end.